Tonight, as you settle into the quiet sanctuary of your bedroom, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through one of humanity's most fascinating puzzles. How individual minds can sometimes merge into something altogether different, like streams flowing into a vast, mysterious ocean. You might think that your thoughts, your decisions, your very sense of self are entirely your own. But what if there's something deeper at work, something that connects us all in ways we're only beginning to understand? What if the boundary between you and everyone else is far more permeable than we ever imagined? If you're enjoying these philosophical journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it lets me know that these quiet explorations are finding their way to the right people. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community connect through these stories, each of us in our own corner of the world, yet somehow traveling together through these timeless questions. Now dim the lights around you, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or perhaps light a candle if that helps you unwind. Let your body sink deeper into your bed, feeling the weight of the day gradually lifting from your shoulders. Take a slow, deep breath, and as you exhale, allow yourself to drift away from the practical concerns of daily life. Tonight, we're stepping into a different realm entirely, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of the collective mind. That mysterious space where individual consciousness meets something far larger and more ancient than ourselves. Imagine yourself walking through the quiet streets of Zurich in the early 1900s, where gas lamps cast dancing shadows on cobblestone paths, and the air carries the crisp scent of alpine snow mixed with the comforting aroma of wood smoke drifting from countless chimneys. The sound of your footsteps echoes softly against the stone buildings, creating a gentle rhythm that seems to match the steady beat of your heart. You're making your way toward a modest house on the outskirts of the city, where warm golden light spills from a second-story window, cutting through the gathering dusk like a beacon of contemplation. As you approach this house, you notice the deep silence that seems to envelope it, not the empty silence of abandonment, but the full, rich silence of deep thought. This is the home of Carl Jung, and tonight he sits in his study, surrounded by books that seem to hold the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The room smells of aged leather and ink, with just a hint of pipe tobacco lingering in the air. Jung is seated at his desk, his hand moving slowly across paper as he writes by the soft light of an oil lamp, the flame flickering gently with each small movement of air in the room. You might settle into the worn leather chair beside his desk, feeling the smooth, supple material that has been shaped by years of other visitors, other seekers of understanding. As you do, you begin to sense something extraordinary about this moment. You're witnessing the birth of ideas that will reshape how we understand the human mind. Jung is grappling with observations that both fascinate and trouble him, patterns he's noticed in his patients' dreams and thoughts that seem to echo across cultures and centuries, as if there's some invisible thread connecting all human consciousness. Like many of us who have ever felt inexplicably drawn to certain symbols, stories, or images without understanding why, Jung had begun to notice that his patients often described remarkably similar dream imagery, despite having completely different backgrounds, cultures, and life experiences. A farmer from rural Switzerland would describe the same archetypal figures that appeared in the dreams of a scholar from Vienna, the same mythic patterns that could be found in ancient texts from Egypt or China. It was as if beneath the surface of individual consciousness lay something shared, something collective, a deeper layer of the psyche that belonged not to any one person, but to humanity itself. Jung called this the collective unconscious, and as he wrote about it that evening, his pen occasionally pausing as he searched for the right words, he was essentially mapping uncharted territory of the human spirit. Picture him looking up from his papers, his eyes reflecting the lamplight as he contemplated the profound implications of what he was discovering. This wasn't simply about individual psychology anymore. This was about understanding how human consciousness itself operates, how we're all connected in ways that run deeper than culture, language, or personal experience. What if, Jung wondered, the stories we tell ourselves about being completely independent individuals are only partially true? What if there's a level of our being that we share with every other human who has ever lived? A psychological inheritance that shapes our thoughts, dreams, and behaviors in ways we're barely aware of. Consider for a moment how certain images, the wise old man, the nurturing mother, the heroic journey, seem to resonate universally, appearing in every culture's mythology and continuing to captivate us in modern stories and films. But Jung's insights went deeper than just recognizing these patterns. He understood that when a society loses its connection to meaningful traditions, myths, and spiritual anchors, when people feel cut off from sources of deeper purpose, they become vulnerable in ways that can be dangerous. It's like removing the roots from a tree. Without those deep connections to hold them steady, individuals can be easily swayed by whatever strong wind happens to blow through their community. They become hungry for meaning, desperate for something to believe in, something to belong to, even if that something might not be worthy of their trust. As you rest in that comfortable chair beside Jung's desk, watching him work by lamplight, you might begin to sense the weight of what he's uncovering. This isn't just academic theory. This is a map of human vulnerability and strength, a guide to understanding how societies can lose their way and how they might find it again. Jung is discovering that the same psychological forces that can create wisdom and healing can also create mass movements, collective delusions, and the kind of social contagion that transforms rational individuals into something else entirely. Perhaps you've felt hints of this yourself, moments when you've been part of a crowd and noticed how different you felt, how the energy of the group seemed to lift you beyond your usual careful, individual judgment. Or times when you found yourself agreeing with ideas simply because everyone around you seemed so certain, even when a quiet voice inside you harbored doubts. Jung was beginning to understand that these aren't signs of weakness or failure. They're fundamental features of how human consciousness operates, for better and worse. Interestingly enough, as Jung continued his exploration that night, he was laying the groundwork for understanding one of the most troubling phenomena in human history: how entire societies can sometimes slip into what we might call collective madness, periods when reason seems to abandon whole populations, and people become capable of actions that would horrify them in their individual reflective moments. But he was also pointing toward hope, toward understanding how awareness of these patterns might help us navigate them more skillfully. As we journey deeper tonight into this landscape of shared consciousness and collective influence, you might find yourself wondering about your own relationship to the groups you belong to, the way your thoughts and feelings can be shaped by forces you're barely aware of. There's something both humbling and oddly comforting about recognizing that we're not as separate as we sometimes imagine, that the boundary between self and others is more like a gentle membrane than a solid wall. This question opens doors to some of the most profound insights about human nature, about why we sometimes lose ourselves in crowds, and how we might maintain our individual clarity while still honoring our deep need to belong. Perhaps by morning, you'll have discovered something new about the delicate dance between independence and connection, between thinking for yourself and being part of something larger than yourself. To truly understand Jung's insight into this collective dimension of human consciousness, we need to first step back into his world more fully, to understand the historical moment that gave birth to these ideas. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves drawn back through time, following those golden threads of understanding that connect one brilliant mind to another across the decades. Let's allow ourselves to drift back to that pivotal time in the early 20th century, where the old certainties were crumbling and thoughtful observers were beginning to glimpse both the promise and the peril of the modern age. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of Paris in the 1890s, where the gaslight creates pools of amber warmth against the gathering dusk. and the cobblestones still echo with the clip-clop of horse hooves mixed with the newer, sharper sounds of early motor cars puttering past ornate iron lampposts. The air carries a complex bouquet of scents: the yeasty aroma of fresh bread from countless boulangeries, the earthy smell of coal smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys, and that distinctive Parisian mixture of roasted coffee and river mist that seems to permeate every neighborhood. As you make your way through these streets, you can feel the pulse of a city in transformation, where traditional ways of life are giving way to something unprecedented in human history. This is the world that shaped the observations of Gustave Le Bon, a French social psychologist whose keen eye for human behavior would prove as influential as it was unsettling. Perhaps you can imagine him on one of his evening walks, his footsteps creating a gentle rhythm against the stone as he observes the way people move through these urban spaces, sometimes as individuals, hurried and purposeful, but other times as something altogether different, something that made him pause and take careful note. Le Bon had begun to notice something deeply curious about human behavior when people gathered together in groups. It wasn't simply that crowds could become unruly. That much had been obvious throughout history. What fascinated and troubled him was the psychological transformation that seemed to occur in individuals when they became part of what he called a psychological crowd. You might recognize this phenomenon from your own experience, those moments when you found yourself part of a larger group and noticed how different you felt, how your usual careful consideration of decisions seemed to dissolve into something more immediate, more emotional, more instinctual. Imagine Le Bon settling into his study on one of those Parisian evenings, the room lit by the soft glow of an oil lamp that casts dancing shadows across walls lined with books on sociology, psychology, and human behavior. As he dips his pen in ink and begins to write, you can almost hear the gentle scratch of steel against paper, punctuated by the occasional pause as he searches for precisely the right words to capture what he's observed. The smell of ink mingles with the faint scent of pipe tobacco, and outside his window, the sounds of the city gradually fade into the comfortable murmur of evening settling over the neighborhood. What Le Bon was documenting would later be recognized as one of the most important insights into human nature, the realization that when individuals come together to form a crowd, something profound happens to their psychology. As he wrote by lamplight, describing his observations with the careful precision of a naturalist studying a new species, he was mapping the transformation that occurs when the conscious personality of the individual becomes submerged beneath what he termed the collective mind. This wasn't merely a poetic metaphor for Le Bon. He was describing a genuine psychological phenomenon, as real and observable as any other aspect of human behavior. Picture yourself as part of a crowd at a concert or sporting event, feeling that electric energy that seems to flow between people, the way your individual voice joins with thousands of others, until you can no longer distinguish your own contribution from the whole. Le Bon understood that in such moments, something genuinely new emerges, not just the sum of all those individual minds, but a distinct entity with its own characteristics, its own patterns of thought and feeling. Perhaps you've experienced this transformation yourself, those times when you found yourself swept up in the energy of a group, whether at a political rally, a religious gathering, or even just a particularly intense discussion with friends. Le Bon observed that in such moments, three distinct mechanisms come into play, working together to dissolve the boundaries of individual consciousness and create something collective and often surprisingly powerful. The first mechanism he identified was anonymity, that strange sense of being both utterly present and somehow invisible that comes from being part of a large group. Imagine yourself in a crowd of thousands, feeling simultaneously connected to everyone around you, and yet oddly unaccountable for your individual actions, as if the sheer number of people somehow diffuses personal responsibility like drops of ink dispersing in water. Le Bon noticed that this anonymity doesn't just make people feel less visible. It actually changes how they behave, often allowing them to act in ways they would never consider when alone. The second mechanism was what he called contagion, the mysterious process by which emotions, ideas, and behaviors spread through a crowd with the speed and inevitability of wildfire. You might have witnessed this yourself, the way laughter can ripple through a theater audience, or how tension can spread through a room when one person becomes agitated, affecting everyone present even when they don't fully understand why. Le Bon observed that in crowds, this emotional contagion operates below the level of conscious thought, creating a shared emotional state that can be more powerful than any individual's rational deliberation. The third mechanism, perhaps the most fascinating of all, was suggestibility, the heightened state of receptivity that emerges when individual critical faculties are suspended in favor of group consciousness. Picture Le Bon documenting how crowd members become extraordinarily receptive to simple, powerful messages, how they respond to dramatic gestures and emotional appeals in ways that would seem almost incomprehensible in their individual reflective moments. It's as if the crowd enters a state similar to hypnosis, where the usual barriers to suggestion dissolve and ideas can take root and spread with remarkable ease. As you rest there in imagination beside Le Bon's desk, watching him work by the gentle light of his lamp, you might begin to appreciate the profound implications of what he was discovering. This wasn't simply an academic exercise. He was mapping the psychological territory that would later help explain some of the most dramatic and troubling events in human history. The same mechanisms that could create the beautiful unity of a choir or the inspiring solidarity of a community coming together in crisis could also produce something far more dangerous. Le Bon understood that the crowd mind, while capable of great passion and energy, was not capable of nuanced thinking. The collective consciousness that emerged from groups operated on emotion rather than logic, on simple images rather than complex ideas, on absolute certainties rather than careful deliberation. The crowd, he observed, thinks not in ideas but in powerful, vivid images that bypass rational analysis and speak directly to the primitive, instinctual parts of the human psyche. Perhaps you can sense the weight of this discovery, the way it illuminated not just how crowds behave, but why they sometimes lose touch with the values and principles that guide them as individuals. Le Bon was documenting a fundamental vulnerability in human nature, the way our deep need to belong, our ancient tribal instincts, could sometimes override our capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning. Interestingly, Le Bon also noticed that this transformation wasn't necessarily negative. The same psychological mechanisms that could produce mob violence could also create moments of genuine transcendence, collective experiences of beauty, purpose, and connection that exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. The crowd mind was neither good nor evil in itself. It was a fundamental feature of human psychology that could manifest in countless different ways, depending on the circumstances and influences that shaped it. As the lamplight flickered gently in Le Bon's study that evening, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across his papers, he was laying the groundwork for understanding one of the most persistent puzzles in human history. How do rational, well-meaning individuals sometimes become part of movements that seem to abandon reason entirely? How do entire societies sometimes slip into patterns of thought and behavior that later generations find incomprehensible? The answers Le Bon was uncovering would prove both illuminating and disturbing, revealing that the capacity for collective delusion wasn't a flaw in human nature, but rather an inherent feature of how consciousness itself operates when individual boundaries begin to dissolve. As you drift deeper into this understanding, you might find yourself wondering about your own experiences of group belonging, the times when you felt most connected to others, and whether those moments involved some surrender of individual judgment. This exploration of the crowd mind naturally opens a doorway to an even deeper question about the nature of human consciousness itself. As you contemplate what Le Bon discovered about the transformation that occurs when individuals merge into collective entities, you might begin to sense that we're approaching something fundamental about what it means to be human, something that exists at the very boundary between self and other, between individual awareness and shared experience. Following this thread deeper into the mystery of consciousness, we find ourselves encountering what might be called the first principle of collective psychology, the remarkable capacity for individual identity to dissolve like morning mist when certain conditions align. What if, in this very moment as you rest here in the quiet sanctuary of your own space, your sense of being a distinct, separate individual, that inner voice that narrates your thoughts and experiences, that feels uniquely and unmistakably you? What if this seemingly solid sense of self is actually far more fluid and permeable than you've ever imagined? Picture yourself as a drop of water, maintaining its perfect spherical form as it clings to a leaf after rainfall, complete and self-contained, until the gentlest breeze causes it to merge with another drop, and then another, until what was once distinctly individual becomes part of something larger, flowing and unified. Perhaps you've experienced hints of this dissolution in your own life, those moments when the boundary between yourself and your surroundings seem to soften and blur. You might recall standing in a cathedral or mosque, feeling the weight of centuries of prayer and contemplation settling around you like a gentle blanket, or perhaps sitting by the ocean at sunset, watching the waves roll endlessly toward shore while your own thoughts seem to merge with the rhythm of the tides. In such moments, the usual chatter of individual consciousness, the constant stream of personal concerns, plans, and self-referential thoughts, grows quiet, replaced by something more expansive and less clearly defined. This phenomenon that Le Bon observed in crowds, this remarkable capacity for individual consciousness to dissolve into collective awareness, operates through what psychologists have come to understand as deindividuation, though perhaps we might think of it more gently as the natural ebb and flow of selfhood, the way individual identity can expand and contract like breathing, sometimes sharp and focused, other times soft and diffuse. Imagine for a moment that your sense of being a separate self is like the flame of a candle in a windless room, bright, distinct, casting clear shadows. But what happens when that flame is brought near others? When the gentle air currents created by their warmth begin to make your own flame dance and flicker, sometimes merging with neighboring flames until it becomes difficult to say where one light ends and another begins. This dissolving of individual boundaries happens through mechanisms that are both simple and profound, operating below the threshold of conscious awareness like the slow shift of tides or the gradual change of seasons. The first mechanism might be understood as anonymity, not simply the practical anonymity of being unknown in a crowd, but something deeper, the psychological experience of feeling both utterly present and somehow invisible, both completely engaged and mysteriously unaccountable for one's actions. Picture yourself in a vast concert hall where thousands of voices join together in song, your own voice adding to the harmony while simultaneously disappearing into it, creating a paradoxical sense of being both essential and invisible at once. You might recognize this feeling from moments in your own life when you've been part of something larger than yourself, perhaps in a theater audience watching a particularly moving performance, where your individual response to the drama becomes indistinguishable from the collective intake of breath, the shared laughter, the communal silence that falls when something profound occurs on stage. In such moments, the usual weight of personal responsibility, the constant awareness of being watched and judged as an individual, seems to lift like fog dispersing in morning sunlight, replaced by a lighter, more expansive sense of being. The second mechanism unfolds like ripples spreading across the surface of a still pond, the phenomenon of emotional contagion, where feelings and impulses spread from person to person with a speed and inevitability that seems to bypass rational thought entirely. Imagine yourself walking into a room where everyone is laughing at some shared joke, and before you even understand what's amusing, you find your own lips curving into a smile, your body relaxing into the warmth of shared mirth. This isn't conscious imitation, but something more primitive and automatic, as if emotions have their own mysterious wavelength that human nervous systems are naturally attuned to receive and transmit. Perhaps you've noticed this in your own experience, the way anxiety can spread through a workplace during times of uncertainty, not through any particular conversation or announcement, but like a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that everyone somehow senses. Or the way joy can ripple through a family gathering, one person's genuine delight somehow awakening corresponding feelings in others, creating a feedback loop of positive emotion that lifts everyone into a state they couldn't have achieved individually. This emotional contagion operates below the level of conscious control, suggesting that our individual emotional states are far more permeable and interconnected than we typically realize. As you rest here, allowing these ideas to wash gently through your awareness like warm water, you might begin to appreciate how the boundaries of selfhood are not as fixed and impermeable as they sometimes seem. The third mechanism of this dissolution involves what we might call enhanced receptivity, a state where the usual filters and defenses that protect individual consciousness from outside influence become more porous and welcoming. Picture the mind as a garden where the gates are usually carefully tended, allowing only selected visitors to enter. But in certain states of consciousness, those gates swing open more freely, permitting ideas and influences to flow in and take root with surprising ease. This heightened suggestibility isn't a weakness or failure of mental discipline, but rather a natural capacity that allows human beings to learn, adapt, and connect with remarkable efficiency. You might have experienced this during meditation or prayer, when the usual skeptical, analytical voice that questions and evaluates every thought grows quiet, allowing deeper insights to emerge from sources that feel both internal and somehow beyond the personal self. Or perhaps in moments of great crisis or celebration, when the normal barriers between yourself and others seem to thin, allowing you to access reserves of courage, compassion, or joy that feel larger than anything you could generate through individual effort alone. Interestingly, this dissolution of individual boundaries reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself, that what we typically experience as a solid, continuous sense of self might be more like a river than a rock, constantly flowing and changing while maintaining a recognizable pattern. The you who woke up this morning is both identical to and subtly different from the you who went to sleep last night, having been shaped by dreams, rest, and the mysterious processes of integration that occur during sleep. In the same way, the you who enters a crowd or group remains essentially yourself, while also becoming part of something larger and different. As you consider this fluid nature of individual identity, you might find yourself wondering about those times when you felt most authentically yourself. Were those moments when you were most isolated and self-contained? Or were they perhaps when you felt most connected to others, most part of something meaningful beyond your individual concerns? This question touches on one of the deepest paradoxes of human experience, that we often discover our truest selves not in isolation, but in relationship, not by building walls around our individuality, but by allowing those boundaries to become more permeable and responsive to the world around us. Perhaps the dissolution of individual consciousness that Le Bon observed in crowds is not simply a psychological curiosity or a potential danger to be guarded against, but also a window into understanding how human consciousness naturally operates, not as isolated islands of awareness, but as part of a larger archipelago of interconnected experience. This recognition opens up profound questions about the relationship between individual autonomy and collective belonging, between maintaining personal integrity and participating fully in shared human experience. This understanding of how individual consciousness can dissolve and reform within collective awareness naturally raises deeper questions about what happens when this process is guided not by wisdom and compassion, but by fear and confusion. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we begin to see how the same psychological mechanisms that can create transcendent experiences of unity and connection can also be directed toward less noble ends. How the dissolution of individual boundaries can become a doorway not to expanded awareness, but to collective delusion and the surrender of critical thinking. Following this thread deeper into the mystery of human susceptibility, we discover that understanding these mechanisms isn't about judging them as good or evil, but rather about recognizing them as fundamental features of how consciousness operates, features that can be cultivated for wisdom or exploited for manipulation. Imagine consciousness as a beautiful old house with many rooms, each representing a different aspect of your mental life. The parlor of rational thought where you carefully consider decisions, the library of memory where experiences are stored and cataloged, the study of values where your deepest principles reside, and the quiet sitting room of intuition where subtle insights emerge without effort. Under normal circumstances, you move freely between these rooms of your mind, consulting different aspects of yourself as situations require, maintaining a sense of integrated awareness that feels coherent and stable. But what happens when certain doors in this house begin to lock? When the rooms of critical thinking and independent judgment become mysteriously inaccessible, leaving you to navigate life from only the more emotional and instinctual spaces of your mental dwelling? Perhaps you've experienced something like this during moments of intense stress or overwhelming emotion, when your usual capacity for measured reflection seemed to temporarily disappear, replaced by more immediate, reactive responses that felt both foreign and strangely compelling. You might recall a time when you found yourself swept up in an online discussion, feeling more passionate and certain about positions than you typically would, your words carrying an intensity that surprised you when you later stepped away from the screen and reflected on what had transpired. In such moments, it's as if the more sophisticated rooms of your mental house became temporarily unavailable, leaving you to operate from spaces that, while genuine parts of yourself, represent only a fraction of your full cognitive and emotional range. This phenomenon that we glimpsed in our exploration of dissolving selfhood operates through mechanisms that are both elegant and profound, working with the precision of natural forces like gravity or magnetism, invisible yet undeniably real, shaping behavior in ways that feel both irresistible and somehow inevitable. The first of these mechanisms might be understood as a kind of psychological short-circuiting, where the complex networks of rational deliberation that typically guide decision-making are bypassed in favor of more direct, emotional pathways that connect perception to action without the usual filtering and evaluation processes that characterize thoughtful reflection. Picture yourself walking through a dense forest where the usual well-marked trails have become obscured by fallen branches and overgrown vegetation, forcing you to rely on more primitive navigation methods. The feeling of wind direction on your skin, the quality of light filtering through the canopy, the sound of distant water that might indicate a stream or clearing. In this environment, you move differently than you would on a clear path, responding more to immediate sensory cues and emotional impressions than to carefully planned routes or detailed mental maps. This is something like what happens when the psychological mechanisms of influence begin to operate, creating conditions where rational deliberation becomes more difficult and immediate emotional responses take precedence in guiding behavior and belief. The architecture of this influence often begins with the subtle manipulation of attention itself, the way a skilled magician directs your gaze toward one hand while the other performs actions you're not meant to notice. You might have experienced this yourself during moments of crisis or emergency, when your attention becomes intensely focused on immediate threats or concerns, creating a kind of tunnel vision that temporarily excludes other considerations from awareness. This narrowing of attention isn't necessarily problematic in genuine emergencies, where quick action based on limited information can be life-saving, but it becomes potentially dangerous when artificially induced to serve purposes that may not align with your deeper interests or values. Interestingly, this focusing of attention often occurs through the strategic use of fear, not the healthy caution that helps you avoid genuine dangers, but a more pervasive anxiety that creates a constant sense of threat, requiring immediate response. Imagine fear as a kind of background music that gradually becomes louder and more insistent, eventually drowning out other melodies of thought and feeling, until it becomes the dominant theme shaping all perception and decision-making. When this happens, the rooms of your mental house dedicated to careful consideration and long-term thinking become harder to access, while the spaces devoted to rapid response and protective action expand to fill more of your available awareness. Perhaps you've noticed how different you feel when operating from a state of chronic low-level anxiety compared to periods when you feel genuinely safe and secure. In anxious states, information that confirms potential threats seems to leap out from the background, while evidence of safety or complexity often goes unnoticed, as if your perceptual apparatus has been recalibrated to prioritize certain types of information over others. This isn't a failure of intelligence or perception, but rather a natural adaptive response that, under the right circumstances, has helped human beings survive and thrive for countless generations. The second wave of influence often involves what we might think of as the compression of complexity into simple, emotionally satisfying narratives that offer immediate relief from the uncomfortable uncertainty that complex situations naturally generate. Picture yourself looking at a vast, intricate tapestry woven with thousands of threads in countless colors and patterns, representing the true complexity of any significant human situation: political, social, personal, or spiritual. Now imagine someone offering you a pair of special glasses that filter out all but two colors, transforming that rich, complex tapestry into a simple pattern of light and dark, good and evil, us and them. You might recognize this simplification process from your own experience of consuming news or information during particularly charged or controversial periods, when nuanced, multifaceted issues become reduced to stark binaries that demand immediate allegiance to one side or another. This compression of complexity isn't necessarily malicious. Human beings have always used storytelling and simplified narratives to make sense of overwhelming amounts of information. But it becomes problematic when the simplification serves to eliminate rather than illuminate understanding, when it closes off rather than opens up possibilities for deeper insight and more skillful response. The third aspect of this architecture involves what we might call the social pressure valve, the way group dynamics can create powerful incentives for conformity that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness like underground streams, shaping the landscape in ways that only become visible over time. Perhaps you've experienced the subtle but unmistakable pressure that emerges in group settings when it becomes clear that certain opinions are welcome while others are not, creating an atmosphere where speaking honestly becomes increasingly difficult, while going along with the prevailing sentiment feels like the path of least resistance. This social pressure doesn't typically announce itself with obvious threats or explicit demands for compliance, but rather operates through more subtle mechanisms: the slight cooling of atmosphere when certain topics are mentioned, the way conversations shift or end when particular perspectives are voiced, the gradual realization that expressing doubts or asking questions marks one as somehow problematic or difficult. These social currents can be as powerful as ocean tides, capable of moving even large objects in directions they never intended to travel, and they operate with particular effectiveness when people are already in states of uncertainty or emotional vulnerability. As you rest here in the safety of your own quiet space, you might notice how different it feels to contemplate these ideas when you're not under any pressure to agree or disagree, when you can let thoughts arise and dissolve without having to defend them or fit them into predetermined categories. This freedom to think without immediate social consequences is actually quite rare in human experience, and its absence creates conditions where the mechanisms of influence can operate with remarkable effectiveness, shaping belief, and behavior in ways that feel natural and chosen, even when they may serve interests quite different from our own. Curiously, understanding these mechanisms doesn't necessarily make us immune to their influence, any more than understanding how optical illusions work prevents us from seeing them. This is because these psychological processes operate at levels of consciousness that exist prior to rational analysis, working with the same fundamental features of human nature that allow us to learn languages, form emotional bonds, and navigate complex social environments. They represent not bugs in the system of human consciousness, but rather features that, under different circumstances, enable remarkable cooperation, learning, and collective achievement. Perhaps the most profound insight emerging from this exploration is that the same psychological architecture that makes us vulnerable to manipulation also makes possible some of our most cherished human capacities: empathy, inspiration, the ability to be moved by beauty or truth, the capacity to change and grow in response to new understanding. The mechanisms that allow us to be influenced by others are inseparable from those that allow us to influence and be influenced by love, wisdom, and genuine insight. This recognition opens up a crucial question about discernment: how we might learn to distinguish between influences that serve our deepest well-being and those that serve other interests entirely. As we continue to follow this thread of understanding, we begin to see how the very mechanisms that create vulnerability can also become sources of strength and wisdom when approached with greater awareness and more skillful means. Drifting further along this philosophical path, we discover that beneath the architecture of influence lies something even more fundamental: a deep human hunger that, when unfed, creates the conditions in which manipulation can flourish like weeds in neglected soil. Picture yourself as a traveler who has been walking for days through an unfamiliar landscape, where the familiar landmarks and well-worn paths of home have given way to territory that shifts and changes with each passing hour. The map you once relied upon no longer corresponds to the terrain before you, and the compass that once pointed true north now spins wildly, offering no reliable guidance for the journey ahead. In such circumstances, the deep human need for orientation, for some sense of direction and purpose, becomes almost overwhelming, a thirst that grows more desperate with each mile of uncertain ground covered. This is something like the condition that creates what we might call the hunger for order, a profound psychological need that shapes human behavior in ways both beautiful and potentially dangerous. Perhaps you've experienced something like this disorientation during times of major life transition: the ending of a relationship, the loss of a job, the death of someone important to you, or simply the gradual realization that beliefs or assumptions you once held with certainty no longer seem adequate to explain your experience. In such moments, the comfortable patterns that once organized your days and gave meaning to your actions may feel suddenly fragile or irrelevant, leaving you in a space that is both full of possibility and tinged with a particular kind of anxiety that comes from not knowing which way to turn or what to believe. This hunger for order isn't simply a preference for tidiness or routine, though it may manifest in such ways. Rather, it represents one of the most fundamental drives in human psychology, what we might think of as the will to meaning, the deep need to live within a framework of understanding that makes sense of both suffering and joy, that provides a sense of purpose and direction, and that connects individual experience to something larger and more enduring than personal concerns. Like the need for food or shelter, this psychological hunger, when left unfulfilled, creates a state of emergency in which almost any source of meaning, no matter how questionable, can begin to look like salvation. Imagine visiting the study of Viktor Frankl in Vienna during the early 1940s, where the gentle afternoon light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows across a desk covered with papers, books, and the careful notes of a psychiatrist who is about to discover something profound about human nature through the crucible of unimaginable suffering. The air in the room carries the faint scent of coffee and pipe tobacco, mixed with the particular smell of old books and well-worn leather furniture that speaks of years of quiet contemplation and careful observation. As Frankl sits writing, occasionally pausing to gaze out at the city beyond his window, he is developing insights that will later help him survive the concentration camps and understand what separates those who maintain their humanity in impossible circumstances from those who do not. Frankl had begun to notice something remarkable in his work with patients, that their psychological health depended less on the presence or absence of suffering, and more on their ability to find meaning within whatever circumstances they faced. Those who could discover purpose in their experiences, even painful ones, showed a resilience and vitality that seemed to transcend their external conditions, while those who felt their lives had no meaning or direction often struggled with despair and apathy regardless of how comfortable their circumstances might appear to others. This observation would later crystallize into his understanding that the primary human drive is neither the pursuit of pleasure nor the accumulation of power, but rather the search for meaning, a search that, when frustrated, creates a kind of existential vacuum that leaves individuals profoundly vulnerable to forces beyond their control. You might recognize this existential vacuum from your own experience or observation, that particular quality of restlessness and dissatisfaction that seems to persist even when external conditions are favorable. The sense that something essential is missing from life, even when basic needs are met and goals are being achieved. This isn't simply boredom or temporary discontent, but rather a deeper hunger for significance, for the feeling that one's life matters in some fundamental way, that individual actions and choices contribute to something meaningful beyond personal gratification or social approval. Picture this hunger for meaning as a kind of psychological gravity that, when healthy sources of purpose are available, draws us toward activities, relationships, and commitments that genuinely serve our deepest values and contribute to the well-being of others. But when traditional sources of meaning, religious faith, cultural traditions, family structures, or meaningful work, begin to weaken or disappear, this same gravitational force can pull us toward whatever appears to offer structure, purpose, and belonging, regardless of whether these substitutes actually serve our long-term flourishing or align with our deepest wisdom. Perhaps you've witnessed this process in communities or cultures undergoing rapid change, where the breakdown of familiar institutions and ways of life creates a kind of collective disorientation that leaves people searching for new sources of identity and purpose. In such situations, movements or ideologies that offer simple, compelling narratives about meaning and belonging can attract followers with remarkable speed, not necessarily because these narratives are true or beneficial, but because they provide relief from the uncomfortable uncertainty that accompanies the loss of traditional anchors for meaning and purpose. This is where the hunger for order intersects with the mechanisms of influence we explored earlier, creating conditions where the dissolution of individual boundaries and the compression of complexity into simple narratives can feel not like manipulation, but like rescue. When people are living in a state of existential vacuum, when the old sources of meaning have dried up like wells in a drought, the offer of a new, clear, emotionally satisfying explanation for life's challenges can feel like water in a desert, regardless of whether that explanation is based on wisdom or wishful thinking. Interestingly, this hunger for meaning operates at levels of consciousness that extend far beyond rational thought, drawing on what Jung called the collective unconscious, those deep, inherited patterns of human experience that express themselves in myths, symbols, and archetypal stories that appear across cultures and throughout history. When individuals lose connection to authentic sources of meaning, they often become susceptible to what we might call counterfeit archetypal experiences, movements or ideologies that mimic the forms of genuine spiritual or cultural traditions, while serving very different purposes than the cultivation of wisdom, compassion, or genuine understanding. You might think of authentic meaning as resembling a deep, clear spring that rises from underground sources and provides nourishment for whatever grows around it, while counterfeit meaning is more like a shallow pool that reflects the sky beautifully, but has no underground source to sustain it during dry seasons. Both may appear refreshing from a distance, but they have very different capacities to support life over time, and distinguishing between them requires a kind of discernment that comes from understanding the difference between temporary relief and genuine nourishment. Perhaps you've experienced both kinds of meaning in your own life, moments when you felt connected to purposes or activities that seemed to draw from deep, renewable sources of significance, where engagement felt both effortless and sustainable over time, and other moments when you found yourself attracted to pursuits or beliefs that offered immediate satisfaction, but somehow left you feeling more empty or restless than before. This distinction between authentic and counterfeit sources of meaning isn't always immediately apparent, particularly when we're operating from states of anxiety, loneliness, or uncertainty that make any source of structure and belonging feel preferable to the discomfort of not knowing. As you rest here in the gentle space between waking and sleeping, you might notice how different it feels to contemplate meaning from a place of relaxation rather than urgency. How questions about purpose and significance can be held lightly rather than grasped desperately. This capacity for patient, non-urgent reflection is actually one of the most important defenses against the manipulation of our meaning-making instincts, because it allows us to sense the difference between sources of significance that serve our deepest well-being and those that serve other interests entirely. Curiously, the very process of understanding how this hunger for meaning can be exploited also reveals how it might be cultivated more skillfully, how we might learn to distinguish between the gravitational pull of authentic purpose and the counterfeit magnetism of movements or ideologies that promise meaning, while actually depleting the very psychological resources they claim to nourish. This recognition points toward the possibility of a more conscious relationship with our own need for significance, one that honors this fundamental drive while developing greater discernment about how and where we seek to fulfill it. This exploration of meaning and its counterfeits naturally raises questions about how these dynamics play out in the broader social and political realm, where the manipulation of our need for purpose and belonging becomes a tool for shaping collective behavior. As we allow these insights to settle and integrate, we begin to see how individual psychology and social dynamics weave together to create the conditions in which entire societies can lose their way. Following this thread deeper into the realm of shared human experience, we discover that beneath our hunger for meaning lies something even more primal, a fundamental vulnerability that, when skillfully activated, can transform the most rational individuals into participants in collective delusions that would have seemed impossible to them in their calmer, more reflective moments. Perhaps you've noticed how fear has a particular quality unlike any other emotion, the way it seems to narrow the world down to a single, urgent focus, making everything else fade into irrelevance while amplifying whatever appears to threaten your safety or well-being. Picture yourself walking alone through a forest at dusk, when the familiar sounds of daytime birds have given way to the mysterious rustlings and creaks that emerge with darkness, and every shadow might conceal something worth worrying about. In such moments, your attention becomes laser-focused on potential dangers, while the beauty of the evening light filtering through the trees, the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers, or the peaceful silence that actually surrounds you recede from awareness like distant memories. We all share this ancient inheritance, a nervous system designed by millions of years of evolution to prioritize survival over contemplation, to respond to threats more quickly than consciousness can fully process them, and to err on the side of caution even when that caution might not be warranted by actual circumstances. This hair-trigger alertness once helped our ancestors survive in genuinely dangerous environments, where the cost of ignoring a real threat was often death. But in our modern world, This same protective mechanism can be activated by threats that exist more in imagination than reality, creating states of chronic anxiety that shape perception and decision-making in profound and often invisible ways. You might recognize this phenomenon from your own experience during times of uncertainty or stress, when worries about the future or regrets about the past begin to dominate your mental landscape, making it difficult to think clearly about anything else or to access the calm, balanced perspective that usually guides your choices. In such states, information that confirms your fears seems to leap out from the background, while evidence that contradicts those fears often goes unnoticed, as if your perceptual apparatus has been recalibrated to prioritize certain types of information over others. This isn't a failure of intelligence or character, but rather a natural adaptive response that, under the right circumstances, helps human beings respond quickly to genuine emergencies. The problem arises when this ancient alarm system is triggered not by actual immediate dangers, but by carefully crafted messages designed to create and maintain states of chronic anxiety for purposes that may have little to do with your actual safety or well-being. When fear becomes the background music of daily life, when every news cycle brings fresh reasons for worry, when social media feeds deliver a constant stream of outrage and alarm, the same psychological mechanisms that once protected us from predators can make us vulnerable to a different kind of predation entirely. Imagine fear as a lens that, when held up to the eye, makes certain objects appear much larger and closer than they actually are, while rendering other things so small and distant that they seem to disappear entirely. Through this lens, potential threats become magnified and immediate, while sources of safety, beauty, and genuine connection fade from view, creating a distorted perception of reality that feels absolutely convincing to the person experiencing it. This distortion isn't random, but follows predictable patterns that can be deliberately triggered and directed by those who understand how fear operates at the level of the nervous system. Perhaps you've observed this process in yourself or others during times of crisis or uncertainty, when reasonable people suddenly become convinced that extreme measures are necessary to address threats that, in calmer moments, they might recognize as manageable or even unlikely to materialize. This transformation doesn't happen through rational persuasion, but through the gradual erosion of psychological safety, the steady accumulation of anxiety that eventually overwhelms the capacity for balanced judgment and nuanced thinking. The architecture of this fear-based influence often begins with the identification and amplification of genuine concerns, real problems or challenges that exist in the world, but are presented in ways that maximize emotional impact rather than understanding. Picture a small flame being fed with increasingly combustible materials until it grows from a manageable campfire into a roaring blaze that threatens to consume everything around it. The original flame may have been legitimate, representing real issues that deserve attention and care, but the process of amplification transforms these concerns into something qualitatively different, sources of panic rather than wisdom, catalysts for reactive behavior rather than thoughtful response. You might have witnessed this transformation in public discourse around various issues, where legitimate concerns about health, safety, or social problems become vehicles for generating sustained states of alarm that make careful analysis and nuanced solutions seem inadequate or even dangerous. In such environments, the complexity and uncertainty that characterize most real-world problems are replaced by simple, emotionally satisfying narratives that promise immediate relief from anxiety in exchange for swift, decisive action that often serves interests quite different from those it claims to protect. Interestingly, this process of fear amplification doesn't typically present itself as manipulation, but rather as education, protection, or public service. Those who craft and disseminate fear-based messages often genuinely believe they are serving the public good by alerting people to dangers that others have failed to recognize or adequately address. This creates a kind of sincerity that can be particularly compelling, especially when the messengers themselves appear to be motivated by genuine care and concern rather than personal gain or political advantage. The second wave of this fear-based influence involves what we might think of as the narrowing of options, the gradual reduction of complex situations into simple choices between safety and danger, protection and vulnerability, taking action and remaining passive in the face of threats. Picture yourself standing at a crossroads where multiple paths once led in different directions, but fear has somehow obscured all but two options. The path that promises immediate security through submission to authority, and the path that leads to certain disaster through continued uncertainty and independent judgment. This binary thinking isn't natural to the human mind, which typically recognizes multiple possibilities and gradations of meaning, even in challenging situations. But fear has a way of collapsing this natural complexity into stark either-or propositions that seem to demand immediate choice without the luxury of careful consideration. In such states, the very act of questioning or seeking additional information can begin to feel like a kind of betrayal, of safety, of community, of basic responsibility to protect oneself and others from harm. Perhaps you felt this pressure yourself during times when taking time to think things through or seeking multiple perspectives was somehow reframed as dangerous delay or selfish indulgence. This urgency is rarely a reflection of actual time pressure, but rather a psychological technique that prevents the kind of calm reflection that might reveal other options or raise uncomfortable questions about the wisdom of the proposed solutions. As you rest here in the gentle safety of your own space, breathing slowly and feeling the solid support of your bed beneath you, you might notice how different it feels to contemplate these ideas from a place of relative calm rather than anxiety. This capacity for peaceful reflection is actually one of our most important resources for maintaining psychological freedom in environments designed to trigger constant alarm, because it allows us to distinguish between genuine threats that deserve our attention and manufactured urgencies that serve other purposes entirely. Curiously, understanding how fear can be weaponized doesn't necessarily make us immune to its influence, any more than understanding how optical illusions work prevents us from seeing them. Fear operates at levels of consciousness that precede rational analysis, working with the same biological systems that keep us alive in genuine emergencies. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, which would be neither possible nor wise, but rather to develop a more conscious relationship with it, to learn to distinguish between the fear that protects and the fear that paralyses, between appropriate caution and manufactured panic. This recognition brings us to one of the most profound insights about human psychology, that the same emotional vulnerabilities that make us susceptible to manipulation also make possible our greatest capacities for love, empathy, courage, and wisdom. The openness that allows us to be influenced by fear also allows us to be moved by beauty, inspired by truth, and motivated by genuine care for others. These capacities are not separate systems, but different expressions of the same fundamental human sensitivity to influence and connection. This understanding of fear's role in shaping collective behavior naturally leads us toward a deeper exploration of how these individual psychological dynamics scale up to influence entire communities and societies. As these insights settle into deeper awareness, we begin to see how the manipulation of fear creates the conditions for even more sophisticated forms of collective influence. Drifting further along this philosophical path, we find ourselves approaching a vista where the patterns we've been exploring reveal themselves not as isolated phenomena, but as recurring themes in the great symphony of human history. Movements that rise and fall with the predictability of tides, yet remain somehow mysterious in their power to transform rational individuals into participants in collective dramas that would have seemed impossible from the perspective of their ordinary, reflective lives. Picture these insights as landmarks in a vast intellectual landscape, each thinker we've encountered adding another point of light to illuminate the darkness of human behavior, like stars gradually appearing in the evening sky as twilight deepens into night. From our vantage point on this gentle hill of understanding, we can see Jung's deep wells of shared unconscious stretching back through generations, Le Bon's crowds moving like flocks of birds across the social horizon, Ashe's experiments revealing the hidden pressures that shape perception like invisible magnetic fields, and Frankl's search for meaning cutting through existential fog like a lighthouse beam. Together, these points of illumination begin to reveal the contours of something larger, a map of human vulnerability and resilience that helps explain some of history's most puzzling and troubling episodes. Perhaps you've wondered, in your own quiet moments of reflection, how seemingly ordinary people throughout history have sometimes participated in events that later generations find almost incomprehensible. How entire communities can become convinced of things that appear obviously false from a different perspective. How rational individuals can support causes that clearly violate their deepest values. How societies can collectively lose their way so completely that recovering their bearings seems almost miraculous. These questions touch on something fundamental about the nature of human consciousness and the delicate balance between individual judgment and collective belonging that shapes every social group, from families to nations. The patterns that emerge from this landscape of understanding suggest that what we might call collective delusions aren't random aberrations, but rather predictable consequences of specific psychological and social conditions coming together in particular ways, like weather systems that form when temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure align to create storms that, while destructive, follow recognizable patterns that can be studied and understood. The Salem witch trials of 1692 provide a particularly clear example of these patterns playing out in a small, contained community where we can observe the mechanisms in detail, like studying a miniature ecosystem that reveals principles applicable to much larger systems. Imagine yourself standing in the village of Salem during that strange winter, where the February air carries the sharp scent of wood smoke and snow, and the constant creak of bare tree branches in the wind creates an atmosphere already thick with tension and uncertainty. The community is living under multiple pressures: political upheaval following changes in the colonial charter, ongoing threats from Native American raids, recent epidemics that have decimated neighboring settlements, and internal conflicts over land and religious authority that have been simmering for years. Into this environment of chronic stress and anxiety comes something that would, under normal circumstances, have been manageable. A few young girls exhibiting strange physical symptoms that their community's worldview interpreted as supernatural attack. You might recognize in this situation the same elements we've been exploring: a population under stress and longing for stability, the emergence of a simple explanation that transforms complex anxieties into a clear narrative of good versus evil, and the gradual creation of social pressures that make dissent increasingly dangerous, while conformity appears increasingly virtuous. What began as a local medical mystery expanded into a community-wide conviction that they were under siege by invisible forces, requiring dramatic action to preserve their survival and spiritual purity. The mechanisms we've explored, the dissolution of individual judgment within group pressure, the weaponization of fear, the hunger for meaning satisfied by simplified narratives, all operated with remarkable efficiency in this small community, creating a feedback loop where initial suspicions generated actions that seemed to confirm those suspicions, which in turn justified increasingly extreme responses. The process was self-reinforcing, like a fire that grows by consuming the very structures that might have contained it, until the community's normal safeguards against injustice, careful deliberation, respect for evidence, protection for the accused, were swept away by the urgent need to protect the group from a threat that existed more in collective imagination than external reality. Perhaps what makes the Salem trials so fascinating from our perspective is not their strangeness, but their familiarity. The way the psychological dynamics they reveal continue to operate in different forms and contexts, adapted to new technologies and social structures, but following remarkably similar patterns. The same human needs and vulnerabilities that created conditions for mass hysteria in 17th century Massachusetts continue to shape collective behavior in our contemporary world, though the forms they take have evolved with our tools and circumstances. The rise of 20th century totalitarian movements represents these same patterns operating on a much larger scale, enabled by new technologies of communication and control that allowed for unprecedented coordination of collective belief and action. Picture yourself in the Germany or Russia of the early 20th century, societies traumatized by war, economic collapse, and the complete breakdown of traditional institutions that had provided meaning and stability for generations. Into this landscape of devastation and disorientation came movements that offered powerful, all-encompassing narratives that promised not just political solutions, but complete transformation of human existence itself. These movements succeeded not primarily through force, though force certainly played a role, but through their ability to satisfy the deep psychological needs we've been exploring, the hunger for meaning in meaningless circumstances, the desire for belonging in atomized societies, the relief that comes from simple explanations for complex suffering. They offered what we might think of as counterfeit transcendence, experiences of unity, purpose, and significance that felt authentic to participants even as they served to destroy the very capacities for independent thought and moral judgment that genuine transcendence typically cultivates and strengthens. Interestingly, these historical examples reveal something profound about the relationship between individual psychology and collective behavior. That the same human capacities that make possible our greatest achievements in art, science, spirituality, and social cooperation also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited for destructive purposes. The openness to influence that allows us to learn from teachers and be inspired by leaders can also make us susceptible to manipulation by those who understand how to trigger our deepest needs and fears. The capacity for self-sacrifice that enables heroic service to others can be redirected toward causes that serve narrow interests while claiming to represent universal values. Perhaps the most sobering insight from this historical perspective is that these patterns don't require particularly evil or even particularly clever people to set them in motion. Often, those who initiate and lead collective delusions genuinely believe in the righteousness of their cause and the accuracy of their perceptions, making their sincerity part of what makes them so compelling to others. The mechanisms of collective delusion operate through the same psychological processes that create genuine community, authentic religious experience, and effective social cooperation. They represent not foreign invasions of human consciousness, but rather natural capacities directed toward ends that don't serve human flourishing. As you rest here in the safety of your own quiet space, you might find yourself wondering about the subtle ways these ancient patterns continue to operate in contemporary life, perhaps in forms so familiar that they've become invisible. The same psychological vulnerabilities that created the conditions for historical mass movements continue to shape how we respond to information, how we form opinions about complex issues, and how we relate to groups and communities we're part of. Understanding these patterns doesn't make us immune to their influence, but it does offer the possibility of greater awareness and more conscious choice about how we engage with the inevitable pressures toward conformity and simplified thinking that characterize all social life. Curiously, this historical perspective also reveals something hopeful about human nature, that these episodes of collective delusion, no matter how powerful or apparently permanent they seem to participants, eventually come to an end. Reality has a way of asserting itself over time. Contradictions accumulate until they can no longer be ignored, and the human capacity for truth-telling and independent thought, while it can be suppressed, rarely disappears entirely. The same psychological flexibility that makes us vulnerable to delusion also makes possible awakening, learning, and the gradual development of greater wisdom about how to navigate the eternal tension between individual autonomy and collective belonging. This recognition that patterns repeat while also evolving brings us naturally toward a deeper exploration of how these timeless psychological dynamics manifest in our current historical moment, where ancient vulnerabilities encounter unprecedented technologies and social structures. As we prepare to examine these contemporary expressions, we begin to see how understanding the past might offer guidance for navigating the present with greater skill and awareness. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves at a place where all the threads we've been following begin to weave together into a larger tapestry, revealing the eternal dance between individual consciousness and collective belonging. A dance that has shaped human experience since our ancestors first gathered around fires to share stories and seek safety in numbers. Imagine a great orchestra where each musician is accomplished and thoughtful individually, capable of creating beautiful music through their own skill and artistry, yet somehow diminished when they insist on playing only their personal compositions without regard for harmony or rhythm that connects them to their fellow performers. Then picture what happens when a conductor appears who understands not only music, but also the psychology of musicians, someone who can inspire them to surrender their individual performances to something larger and more magnificent than any could achieve alone. This conductor might lead them toward transcendent beauty, where individual excellence serves collective magnificence, or might direct them toward monotonous repetition, where creativity is sacrificed to rigid uniformity. The same capacity for collaborative creation that enables symphonic beauty also makes possible the reduction of complex musical voices to simple, repetitive themes that gradually drain the life from the very artistry they claim to celebrate. Perhaps you've experienced both kinds of collaboration in your own life, moments when joining with others in shared purpose felt like an expansion of your capabilities and deepest values, where individual contribution and collective achievement seemed to enhance each other in ways that created something genuinely new and beautiful, and other times when group participation required a diminishment of your authentic voice, where belonging seemed to demand the sacrifice of the very qualities that made your participation valuable in the first place. This distinction between life-giving and life-draining forms of collective experience isn't always immediately apparent, particularly when we're motivated by loneliness, uncertainty, or the genuine desire to contribute to something meaningful beyond our individual concerns. The psychological mechanisms we've been exploring, the dissolution of individual boundaries, the hunger for meaning, the manipulation of fear, the power of social pressure, operate in both directions, serving sometimes as gateways to genuine transcendence and wisdom, other times as pathways to collective delusion and the abandonment of critical thinking. Like tools that can be used to build or destroy, depending on the skill and intention of those who wield them, these fundamental features of human psychology are neither inherently beneficial nor harmful, but rather neutral capacities that can serve radically different ends, depending on how they're cultivated and directed. Picture consciousness itself as a vast river system where individual streams of awareness flow into larger tributaries, which join with others to form great rivers that eventually merge with an ocean of shared human experience. When this process unfolds naturally, guided by wisdom and compassion, it can create extraordinary beauty. The collective insights of scientific communities pushing the boundaries of understanding, the collaborative artistry of musicians or dancers creating performances that transport audiences into states of wonder, the coordinated efforts of communities responding to natural disasters with remarkable efficiency and care. These experiences represent individual consciousness expanding into collective wisdom, without losing its essential qualities of discernment, creativity, and moral sensitivity. You might recognize this positive form of collective consciousness from your own experience of particularly meaningful group activities. Perhaps singing in a choir where your individual voice contributed to harmonies that no one could create alone, or working on a team where everyone's unique skills combine to solve problems beyond any individual's capacity, or participating in a gathering where conversation flowed so naturally that insights emerged that surprised everyone present. As if the group had accessed a kind of intelligence that transcended any individual's knowledge or understanding. But the same river system that can create such beauty can also become polluted, redirected, or artificially channeled in ways that serve purposes quite different from the flourishing of those whose consciousness flows through it. When the mechanisms of collective influence are guided not by wisdom, but by fear, not by genuine care for human well-being, but by the desire for power or control, the result is what we might think of as counterfeit transcendence. Experiences that feel meaningful and important to participants while actually diminishing their capacity for independent thought, authentic relationship, and moral clarity. Interestingly, these counterfeit forms of collective experience often begin with genuine human needs and legitimate concerns, much like a river that starts as clean mountain spring water, but becomes contaminated as it flows through polluted landscapes. The initial desire for meaning, belonging, and purposeful action is authentic and healthy, but the channels through which these desires are directed may serve interests quite different from those they claim to represent. This makes distinguishing between authentic and inauthentic forms of collective experience particularly challenging, especially for those who are operating from states of anxiety, loneliness, or desperation for clear answers to complex questions. Perhaps you've observed this dynamic in contemporary social and political movements, where genuine concern for important issues, justice, safety, environmental protection, economic fairness, becomes the starting point for processes that gradually transform participants into something resembling what we explored in Le Bon's description of crowd psychology. Individual nuanced understanding gives way to simplified slogans. Complex problems are reduced to binary choices between good and evil, and questioning or doubt becomes reframed not as healthy skepticism, but as betrayal of the cause and the community. The challenge of discernment, learning to distinguish between collective experiences that serve human flourishing and those that serve other purposes, requires understanding that the same psychological mechanisms operate in both cases. Both authentic and counterfeit forms of collective consciousness involve the dissolution of rigid individual boundaries. Both can generate powerful feelings of meaning and purpose. Both can create intense experiences of belonging and shared identity. The difference lies not in the presence or absence of these experiences, but in their fruits, whether they tend to increase or decrease participants' capacity for love, wisdom, creativity, and genuine service to life. As you rest here in the gentle space between waking and sleeping, you might notice how different it feels to contemplate these questions from a place of relaxation rather than urgency. How the pressure to choose sides or reach definitive conclusions naturally diminishes when you're not operating from anxiety or the need to defend particular positions. This capacity for patient, non-urgent reflection is actually one of our most important resources for navigating the eternal tension between individual autonomy and collective belonging, because it allows us to sense the difference between invitations to authentic participation and manipulative attempts to bypass our critical faculties. Curiously, this exploration reveals that the ancient philosophical question of the relationship between individual and collective consciousness isn't something to be solved once and for all, but rather a dynamic balance to be maintained moment by moment throughout our lives. We are simultaneously utterly unique individuals with irreplaceable perspectives and contributions, and fundamentally interconnected beings whose well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the larger wholes of which we're part. This paradox isn't a problem to be resolved, but rather a creative tension to be celebrated and skillfully navigated. The capacity for individual consciousness to expand into collective awareness without losing its essential qualities appears to depend on what we might call the cultivation of discernment, the ability to distinguish between influences that serve our deepest flourishing and those that serve other interests, between invitations to authentic growth and manipulative attempts to exploit our natural vulnerabilities. This discernment isn't something we either have or don't have, but rather a skill that can be developed through practice, reflection, and the gradual accumulation of experience with different forms of individual and collective engagement. Perhaps the most profound insight emerging from this synthesis is that individual consciousness and collective consciousness are not fundamentally opposed forces, but rather complementary aspects of a larger wholeness, like breathing in and breathing out, or like the alternating rhythms of systole and diastole that keep the heart pumping life through the body. Healthy individual development actually requires authentic collective experience, while genuine collective wisdom depends on the participation of individuals who have maintained their capacity for independent thought and moral sensitivity. This understanding of the dance between individual and collective consciousness naturally leads us toward exploring how these insights might be applied in our contemporary world, where ancient psychological patterns encounter new technologies and social structures that can either amplify wisdom or accelerate delusion. As we begin to consider practical applications of what we've discovered, we find ourselves approaching questions about how to live skillfully in a world where the mechanisms of influence are both more powerful and more subtle than ever before. Following this thread deeper into the landscape of our present moment, we discover that the same timeless vulnerabilities that shaped human behavior in Jung's Vienna, Le Bon's Paris, and the villages of colonial Salem continue to operate today, though they now wear digital costumes and move at speeds that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Picture yourself scrolling through your phone on a quiet evening, the soft blue glow of the screen casting gentle shadows across your face as your thumb moves in the familiar rhythm of endless browsing, each swipe revealing new fragments of information, opinion, and emotion that seem to demand immediate response. In your own life, you might have noticed how different you feel when you're absorbed in this digital flow compared to moments when you're sitting quietly without any screens, how the quality of your thoughts and the rhythm of your attention seem to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Perhaps you've observed how an online discussion can escalate with remarkable speed, how reasoned conversation can transform into something more heated and polarized almost before you realize what's happening, as if the technology itself were somehow amplifying certain aspects of human nature while muting others. The ancient patterns we've been exploring, the dissolution of individual boundaries, the hunger for meaning, the manipulation of fear, the power of social conformity, haven't disappeared with the advent of digital technology. Instead, they've found new expressions and vastly enhanced capabilities, like old melodies played through modern amplification systems that can reach audiences of unprecedented size with unprecedented speed and precision. The psychological vulnerabilities that once made small communities susceptible to witch trials or entire nations vulnerable to totalitarian movements now operate in a global information environment, where millions of people can be influenced simultaneously by carefully crafted messages designed to trigger their deepest fears and most urgent longings. You might recognize these digital versions of ancient patterns from your own online experience. The way certain posts or videos seem designed to provoke immediate emotional reactions rather than thoughtful reflection. How complex issues become reduced to simple images or slogans that spread with viral efficiency. How social media platforms seem to reward the most extreme voices, while more nuanced perspectives struggle to gain attention. This isn't accidental, but rather the result of systems specifically designed to capture and hold human attention by exploiting the same psychological mechanisms that Le Bon identified in his study of crowds more than a century ago. Imagine these digital platforms as vast architecture of influence, like cathedrals built not from stone and stained glass, but from algorithms and data streams, designed to create particular kinds of psychological experiences in their users. Just as the builders of medieval cathedrals understood how soaring arches and colored light could inspire feelings of transcendence and awe, the architects of digital platforms understand how carefully timed notifications, personalized content feeds, and social validation systems can create powerful feelings of engagement, belonging, and meaning. Feelings that keep users returning again and again, even when that engagement might not serve their deeper well-being or authentic interests. Perhaps you've noticed how these digital environments can create what we might call pseudo-communities, groups of people who feel deeply connected to shared causes or identities, but who might struggle to maintain that same sense of connection in face-to-face interactions where the complexity and humanity of others becomes more apparent. These online communities can provide genuine support and meaningful connection, but they can also become echo chambers where the natural human tendency toward confirmation bias becomes amplified by algorithms that feed users increasingly extreme versions of whatever content they've previously engaged with. The speed and scale of digital communication also create new versions of what we explored as emotional contagion, where feelings and beliefs can spread through networks of connected people, with a velocity that bypasses the usual processes of reflection and consideration that help distinguish between wisdom and temporary emotional reactions. You might have experienced this yourself, seeing a news story or social media post that triggered immediate outrage or anxiety, sharing it with your own network before fully processing its content or verifying its accuracy, and later discovering that the information was incomplete, misleading, or deliberately crafted to provoke exactly the kind of immediate, unreflective response you had. This acceleration of influence creates what we might think of as digital versions of mass psychogenic illness, where psychological and even physical symptoms can spread through online communities with remarkable speed. Consider the phenomenon of social media challenges that encourage dangerous behaviors, or the way certain physical and emotional symptoms seem to spread through online communities of young people who identify with particular diagnoses or conditions. These aren't necessarily cases of deliberate deception, but rather examples of how the ancient human capacity for social contagion operates in digital environments where the usual social and physical constraints on suggestion and imitation have been removed. Interestingly, the same technologies that can accelerate the spread of delusion and manipulation also create unprecedented opportunities for wisdom, learning, and authentic connection. The internet makes possible global conversations between people who would never have encountered each other's perspectives in previous eras, allows for the rapid sharing of scientific discoveries and artistic creations, and enables forms of collaboration and mutual support that can genuinely serve human flourishing. The difference lies not in the technology itself, but in how it's designed and used, whether it serves to expand our capacity for discernment and authentic relationship, or to exploit our vulnerabilities for purposes that don't align with our deeper values and interests. As you rest here in the gentle quiet of your own space, you might notice how different it feels to contemplate these questions from a place of calm reflection, rather than the urgent, reactive state that digital environments often encourage. This capacity for patient, non-urgent consideration is actually one of our most important resources for navigating contemporary challenges, because it allows us to distinguish between information that deserves our attention and mental energy and content that's designed primarily to capture our attention for commercial or political purposes. Perhaps the most profound challenge of our digital age is learning to maintain what we might call conscious engagement with technologies that are specifically designed to operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, to trigger automatic responses rather than thoughtful consideration. This doesn't mean rejecting technology entirely, which would be neither practical nor necessarily wise, but rather developing greater awareness of how these tools affect our consciousness and making more deliberate choices about when and how we engage with them. You might think of this as developing a kind of digital discernment, similar to the capacity for distinguishing between authentic and counterfeit sources of meaning that we explored earlier. Just as we can learn to sense the difference between influences that serve our genuine well-being and those that serve other interests, we can develop greater sensitivity to the quality of our online experiences, noticing when digital engagement leaves us feeling energized, connected, and more capable of clear thinking versus when it leaves us feeling depleted, agitated, or somehow less ourselves than before. Curiously, this exploration of contemporary challenges also reveals something hopeful about human nature, that the same capacity for awareness and choice that allows us to be influenced by digital manipulation also makes possible more conscious and skillful forms of engagement with these powerful technologies. The wisdom traditions we've been exploring, from Jung's insights about meaning and wholeness to Frankl's understanding of our fundamental need for purpose, remain as relevant today as they were in earlier eras, perhaps even more so given the increased pace and complexity of modern influence. This recognition that ancient wisdom remains relevant to contemporary challenges naturally brings us toward the deepest questions of our exploration. Not just how to understand the mechanisms of collective influence, but how to live with greater awareness and skill in a world where these mechanisms are constantly operating. As we prepare to gather together all the insights from our journey, we find ourselves approaching a kind of integration where understanding becomes the foundation for more conscious and compassionate engagement with both our individual development and our participation in the larger human community. Like the gentle transition from wakefulness to sleep that you're experiencing now, our exploration begins to soften into something more felt than thought, more intuitive than analytical, as if the very process of understanding these patterns of consciousness naturally leads us toward a deeper recognition of what lies beyond the patterns themselves. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the pace of our inquiry begins to slow, like a river that has been rushing through narrow gorges, finally spreading into a wide, peaceful delta where waters can meander and pool, where thoughts can settle like silt carried by currents that no longer need to hurry toward any particular destination. Perhaps you can feel this shift happening within yourself as well, the way your breathing has naturally deepened and lengthened during our time together, the way your body has gradually released the subtle tensions of the day, the way your mind has moved from its usual focused attention to something more diffuse and receptive, more like the awareness that emerges just before sleep carries you into dreams. What is the boundary between self and other, between individual wisdom and collective wisdom, between the healthy need to belong and the dangerous surrender of judgment that we've been exploring throughout this journey together? As you settle deeper into the comfortable darkness behind your closed eyelids, these questions begin to feel less like problems requiring solutions, and more like gentle invitations to a kind of wondering that doesn't demand answers. A contemplation that finds its fulfillment not in conclusions, but in the quality of attention itself, in the spacious awareness that can hold complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast ocean at twilight, where the boundary between sky and water becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish, as darkness gently erases the sharp lines that define the world during daylight hours. The waves roll endlessly toward shore with a rhythm that seems to match your breathing, carrying with them the ancient memory of countless tides, countless moments when other human beings have stood at similar shores and felt the same sense of being both utterly small and somehow connected to something immeasurably vast. In this image, you might recognize something about the nature of consciousness itself, the way individual awareness emerges from and returns to something larger, like waves that rise from the ocean only to dissolve back into it, never truly separate despite their apparent individuality. Perhaps these questions about individual and collective consciousness matter less than the gentle awareness they create, the soft recognition that we are both utterly unique and utterly connected, both independent minds capable of clear thinking and parts of something larger than ourselves that shapes our thoughts and feelings in ways we can only partially understand. This isn't a contradiction to be resolved, but rather a fundamental characteristic of what it means to be human, to exist simultaneously as autonomous individuals, and as inherently social beings whose well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the communities and ecosystems of which we're part. You might find yourself remembering moments from your own life when this paradox felt most alive, times when you were most genuinely yourself, and yet most connected to others, when individual authenticity and meaningful belonging seem to support rather than contradict each other, when the boundary between self and world felt more like a gentle membrane than a rigid wall. These experiences point toward something profound about the nature of healthy human development, suggesting that genuine individuation and authentic community participation are not opposing forces, but rather complementary aspects of a larger process of becoming fully human. As you drift deeper into relaxation, allowing your thoughts to become softer and more dreamlike, you might notice how the urgent questions that occupied us earlier in our journey, questions about manipulation and resistance, about individual autonomy and collective pressure, begin to transform into something more like poetry than philosophy, more like meditation than analysis. The same insights remain present, but they're held now within a larger container of acceptance and compassion, as if understanding the mechanisms of influence naturally leads to a kind of forgiveness for our human vulnerabilities, a recognition that the very openness that makes us susceptible to manipulation also makes possible our capacity for love, learning, and genuine connection. Interestingly, this dissolution of urgent questioning doesn't represent a retreat from engagement with the world, but rather a different quality of engagement, one based more on presence than position, more on witnessing than winning, more on understanding than being understood. From this softer perspective, the challenges we face, both individually and collectively, begin to appear not as enemies to be defeated, but as aspects of the human condition to be met with greater skill and compassion, opportunities for developing wisdom rather than problems that shouldn't exist. Picture yourself in a garden at dawn, where the first light is just beginning to reveal the shapes of plants and pathways that were hidden in darkness, but where much still remains in shadow, waiting for full daylight to reveal its true form. This might represent something about our understanding of consciousness and influence. We've illuminated certain patterns and mechanisms, traced some of the pathways by which individual awareness connects with collective experience, but much remains mysterious. And perhaps that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but rather a fundamental feature of the terrain we're exploring. In your quieter moments, you may have wondered whether the goal of understanding these patterns is to become immune to influence entirely, to achieve some kind of perfect individual autonomy that stands apart from all collective pressure and social connection. But as you rest here in the gentle space between waking and sleeping, you might sense that such complete independence would be neither possible nor desirable, that we are inherently influenced beings, shaped by countless interactions with others, and that the question isn't how to avoid influence, but how to become more conscious and skillful in choosing which influences we allow to shape us, and how we respond to the inevitable pressures of living in relationship with others. Perhaps the deepest wisdom emerging from our exploration is that individual consciousness and collective consciousness are not fundamentally opposed forces requiring us to choose sides, but rather complementary aspects of a larger wholeness that includes and transcends both. Like breathing in and breathing out, like the systolic and diastolic rhythms that keep the heart pumping life through the body, like the alternating patterns of sleeping and waking that allow both rest and activity. The dance between individual autonomy and collective belonging creates the dynamic tension within which human consciousness develops and flourishes. Tonight, as you allow yourself to drift towards sleep, you join an ancient community of minds that have contemplated these same questions. The relationship between self and other, between independence and connection, between the individual journey toward authenticity and the collective journey toward wisdom and compassion. Your own process of falling asleep becomes a perfect metaphor for what we've been exploring. The gradual dissolution of the busy, separate self into something larger and more peaceful. The natural letting go of individual control into a state of trust and receptivity where healing and integration can occur without effort or intervention. As your individual awareness gradually softens and dissolves, you're not losing yourself, but rather returning to a source that was always present, like a river flowing back to the ocean from which it originally emerged. In sleep, the boundaries between self and world naturally dissolve, questions fade into quiet knowing, and consciousness flows like water returning to its source, carrying you gently into that timeless space where individual and collective wisdom meet and merge in the deep, dreamless rest that restores both body and soul. The philosophical journey we've shared tonight becomes part of this larger movement toward integration and peace. The insights we've explored settling into your deeper awareness like seeds planted in rich soil, where they can take root and grow in their own time, in their own way, without any effort or intention on your part. In the democracy of sleep, all minds are equal, all consciousness returns to the same source, and the ancient patterns of influence and belonging that we've been studying reveal themselves to be expressions of the fundamental interconnectedness that holds all life in its gentle, inexorable embrace. As these thoughts settle into the deepest parts of your mind, Jung's insights and Le Bon's observations become like distant bells, still ringing but fading into the vast quiet that holds all questions and all answers. No need to hold on to these ideas about individual and collective consciousness, as they find their own resting place in the soft spaces between thoughts, where understanding needs no effort, no memory, no conscious attention.